Before the sky caught fire, Mars was a world of quiet thunder. It was a planet of heavy stone, deep cold waters, and towering metallic spires that hummed with the endless blue energy of a civilization at its absolute physical peak. To look upon the Martian cities in those days was to look upon the pinnacle of engineering in our solar system. The people here were builders. They were structural architects of a world that demanded absolute respect. They did not build for beauty or vanity, though their sprawling, dark stone cities possessed a stark, terrifying majesty. They built for endurance. They believed their walls, their planetary shields, and their heavy kinetic cannons would stand until the stars themselves burned out in the deep void of space. They had conquered their environment. They had mastered the atom, the plasma current, and the deep geothermal forces of the planet's core. But in their mastery of the physical universe, they had grown deaf to the whispers of the unseen one. They trusted their long-range telemetry arrays over their instincts. They trusted their steel over their souls. And in those final, quiet hours before the heavens tore open, the illusion of their permanence was absolutely perfect. Kael was a man of the stone, a tactical engineer and heavy munitions specialist assigned to the perimeter energy grid of the capital's central defense sector. He was a man built for a hard world, grounded, practical, and relentlessly unshakable. He didn't care about the high politics of the orbital councils. He didn't care about the whispered, anxious tensions echoing from their sister planet, Maldek, or the rumors of strange, crescent-shaped shadows moving silently through the outer asteroid fields. His world was the grid. His duty was to keep the planetary energy flowing, the defensive shields calibrated, and his unit alive. For 5 years he had stood on these high observation decks, watching the blue atmospheric haze swirl above the sprawling city, listening to the deep, rhythmic thrum of the underground generators vibrating through the soles of his heavy boots. It was a lonely life, defined entirely by routine, physical discipline, and the cold comfort of a heavy particle rifle. But it was a life that made sense. Steel could be trusted, energy could be measured, and if the worst ever came to pass, Kael knew exactly what to do. His standing orders were permanently burned into his mind. If the perimeter falls, fall back to the Aegis Vault, the deep planetary command center buried under 50 miles of solid bedrock in the northern ridge. But on the day the world ended, the first warning didn't come from the deep space telemetry arrays. It didn't come from his commanding officers at Aegis Command, or the long-range thermal scanners he had spent half his life calibrating. It came from a ghost. Her name was Lyra. She belonged to the Sensitives, a rare, deeply insulated caste connected to the planet's resonance, the silent, telepathic hum beneath the stone. But Lyra wasn't just a sensitive. She wore the dark, intricately woven polymer robes of the High Circle. She was a prime resonator, one of the few minds capable of interfacing directly with the deep space psychic currents. She didn't belong in the industrial sector. She belonged in the silent, vaulted meditation halls of the High Council. Yet there she was, having bypassed 3 layers of automated security, trembling violently in the sweltering heat of the generator deck. She was clutching a glowing crystalline data drive to her chest as if it were a beating heart. She was staring up at the heavy metal ceiling, her striking, dark, slanted eyes wide with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Kael stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing sharply on the metal grating. He blocked her path, his hand instinctively dropping to the worn grip of his heavy sidearm. "This is a restricted zone," he said, his voice hard, steady, carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of the perimeter guard. "You need to leave immediately." She didn't step back. She didn't flinch at the threat of the weapon. Instead, she looked up at him. When their eyes met, Kael felt a strange, sudden pressure at the base of his skull, a fleeting, silent vibration in his own mind. She was reading him, searching his surface thoughts for any sign of panic, and finding only solid, heavily fortified discipline. She reached out, her delicate fingers hovering just inches from his armored chestplate, as if she desperately needed a physical anchor to keep from drowning. "They are coming," she whispered. Her voice was musical, but trembling with an unbearable, crushing weight. "The sensors won't see them until it is too late. The sky is tearing open. Soldier, I can feel the heat in their minds, a billion cold minds burning with hate." Kael opened his mouth to ask who she meant. to demand her clearance codes, to trigger his comms and call for Aegis command. But the words never left his throat. The air pressure in the observation deck dropped so violently his ears popped. The deep, ambient hum of the city's generators, the heartbeat Kyle had listened to for 5 years, faltered, sputtered, and died. It was replaced by a deafening, unnatural roar that vibrated in Kyle's very teeth. The emergency lights flared a harsh, violent crimson. Kyle turned to the massive reinforced windows. The heavens were breaking. Massive, crescent-shaped warships, larger than anything Martian engineering had ever conceived, descended through the cloud layer like the fists of an angry god. They were formed of a jagged, brutalist black metal that seemed to absorb the light, eclipsing the sun and casting the sprawling capital city into immediate, terrifying twilight. They didn't hail the capital. They didn't transmit demands. They had come to exterminate everything that walked upon the stone. The first beam of raw, searing red-orange plasma hit the city center, instantly vaporizing 1,000,000 tons of stone, steel, and flesh in a blinding flash. Instinct took over. Kyle didn't think about his commanding officers. He didn't think about the perimeter grid. He only knew she was fragile, the sky was falling, and his body was covered in armor. He lunged. He hit her at the waist, pulling her violently to the deck. He wrapped his heavy, armored frame entirely around her, burying her face into his chest as the shockwave tore the observation deck apart. The reinforced glass shattered into 1,000,000 lethal fragments, raining over his back. A wave of unimaginable heat washed over Kyle's armor, instantly scorching the protective gray plating. The world ended in a roar of fire and ash. The deafening roar of the strike slowly faded into the horrific, cascading sound of a crumbling city. Ash rained down in the dark, hissing as it touched the superheated metal of the deck. Kyle opened his eyes. His shoulder burned with a sickening heat where the armor had taken the brunt of the thermal wave. He pushed himself up onto his forearms and looked down at the woman shielded beneath him. He expected hysterics. He expected the sensitive to be shattered by the psychic death toll of the city. But she wasn't screaming. She was perfectly still, just looking up at him. Her dark, slanted eyes were wide, taking in the absolute, undeniable fact that this complete stranger had just thrown his armored body between her and the apocalypse without a fraction of a second's hesitation. "I'm Kyle," he grunted, his voice rasping from the ash. She reached up. Her touch was deliberate. She gently rested her fingers against the scorched, smoking metal of his chest plate. "Lyra," she said softly. Kyle nodded. He pulled his heavy particle rifle from its holster, racked a plasma charge into the chamber with a loud, metallic clack, and hauled himself to his feet. He reached down, grabbing her hand and pulling her up beside him. "We can't stay here," Kyle said, his eyes scanning the burning horizon through the shattered windows. "The perimeter is gone. My standing orders are to fall back to the Aegis Vault in the northern ridge. It's 50 miles deep. If there is a command structure left on this planet, it's there." Lyra looked at the glowing crystalline drive still clutched in her hand, then looked up at him. "Aegis Command," she whispered. "Yes, they need to see what I pulled from the void. They need to know why this is happening." Kyle nodded. "Stay behind me, Lyra. We're going to Aegis." The city was dead, but it was not quiet. In a matter of minutes, the pride of the Martian engineers had been reduced to a jagged, sprawling graveyard of burning steel and toxic ash. The air had turned heavy, a suffocating soup of vaporized metal and raw ozone. It was a dead zone, and in a dead zone, the only rule of survival is to keep moving. Kyle led the way through the jagged canyons of collapsed towers, his heavy boots crushing the glowing embers. He moved with the silent, relentless efficiency of a man who had spent his life anticipating violence. He didn't look back to check if Lyra was following. He didn't need to. He could hear the soft, hurried rhythm of her footsteps exactly in time with his own. She was stepping precisely where he stepped, using his broader, armored frame to break the harsh, acidic wind that was beginning to sweep through the ruins. She held the glowing crystalline data drive tight against her chest. She didn't panic. She didn't cry out. She just survived. But for Lyra, the physical destruction of the stone and steel was only a fraction of the horror. As a prime resonator, her mind was a wide-open receiver. She wasn't just seeing the ruins. She was drowning in the psychic death screams of 1,000,000 Martian souls who had been vaporized in the plasma fire. Every time they passed a collapsed residential sector, she stumbled, her hand flying to her temple to block out the silent agony. Kyle noticed. He didn't offer soft words of comfort. He couldn't. Instead, he reached back, his heavy, scorched gauntlet grabbing her delicate shoulder, physically grounding her to the present moment. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice a low, steady rumble over the wind. "Don't listen to the ghosts. Listen to me. We have 48 miles to the Aegis Vault. Focus on the stone." The physical touch worked. The warmth of his hand, the solid, unyielding reality of his armor, pulled her back from the psychic void. She nodded, her breathing slowing, but suddenly her fingers dug fiercely into the scorched metal of his shoulder. Kyle froze instantly, his heavy particle rifle snapping up to his shoulder. He scanned the ruins, but his eyes saw nothing but smoke and twisted steel. "Cold mines," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling but intensely urgent. "Just beyond the collapsed archway. They don't feel anger or fear. They just calculate. They are sweeping the grid." Kyle didn't demand proof. He didn't hesitate. He stepped fully in front of her, placing his body squarely between Lyra and the archway just as the scouting party rounded the corner. They were grotesque, short, frail-looking gray entities in skin-tight metallic suits, their pitch-black eyes entirely devoid of anything resembling a soul. Ground sweeps. The automated cleanup crew for the Crescent ships sent down to wipe out whatever the plasma beams had missed. The gray things raised their angular weapons, but Kyle was already firing. The heavy, concussive thunder of his particle rifle echoed through the ruins, shattering the silence. He didn't seek cover. He became the cover. He walked forward, driving them back with a wall of pure kinetic violence. An angular beam of red energy seared through the ash, grazing his shoulder and shattering his armor plating. Kyle grunted, the pain flashing hot and deep into his muscle, but he didn't stop firing until the black-eyed things were broken and smoking on the ground. He lowered his rifle, his breathing ragged, turning back to check on Lyra. It was the only mistake he made, and it nearly cost him his life. A fourth drone, buried under a collapsed support beam, suddenly dragged itself upward. It didn't fire a lethal plasma bolt. It triggered a thermal flash charge. The detonation was completely silent, but the light it produced was absolute. A blinding, searing white glare erupted perfectly at Kyle's eye level. Kyle screamed, dropping his heavy rifle as his hands flew to his face. The white light burned through his retinas like physical fire, instantly plunging his world into absolute, terrifying darkness. Lyra didn't freeze. Seeing Kyle fall, the prime resonator lunged forward. She grabbed a heavy shard of jagged steel from the rubble and drove it violently downward, crushing the damaged drone before it could recharge its weapon. The immediate threat was dead, but as the silence returned to the ash-choked ruins, a far more terrifying reality set in. Kyle fell to his knees in the ash. He blinked rapidly, desperately, but the darkness didn't lift. He was completely blind. For a man whose entire existence relied on control, on physical dominance, and on anticipating the physical geometry of a battlefield, the sudden loss of his sight was completely shattering. He reached out frantically, his heavy, armored hands grasping at the empty, toxic air, completely untethered from the world. Then, soft, delicate fingers wrapped gently around his wrists, stopping his frantic movements. Lyra knelt in front of him. "Kyle," she said, her voice dropping its musical tremor and adopting a quiet, unshakable authority. "Listen to me." "I can't see." Kyle ground out, his voice thick with a sudden, humiliating panic he couldn't suppress. "My optic nerves are burned. I'm blind." "I know," Lyra said softly. She didn't let go of his wrists. "The flash burn is deep, but it is not permanent. My resonance can heal the nerve tissue, but not here, not in the open. We have to find shelter." Kyle shook his head violently. "I'm a liability. I can't protect you in the dark. Take the data drive. Leave me here." "No," Lyra said. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute command. She stood up, pulling the heavy, muscular soldier to his feet with surprising strength. She picked up his heavy particle rifle from the ash, grunting slightly under the unfamiliar weight of the weapon. Then she took his large, calloused hand and placed it firmly upon her delicate shoulder. "You led me through the fire," she whispered, her dark eyes scanning the treacherous ruins ahead. "Now I am going to lead you through the dark." Kyle, the unbreakable wall, the man of the stone, had no choice. For the first time in his life, he had to surrender total control and trust his life entirely to the woman beside him. If you are enjoying this story, please be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. The story is fictional, but it is based on a real event that is described in detail in our project, The War in Heaven, that you can find on FarsightPrime.com. The truth is waiting for you. Now, back to the story. The journey through the dark was a brutal, meticulous process. For Kael, the world had shrunk to the physical sensation of the stone beneath his heavy boots and the fragile, steady anchor of Lara's shoulder beneath his hand. He was completely blind. The man who had spent his life dominating the physical geometry of the battlefield was now entirely at the mercy of it. Every jagged piece of steel, every unseen crater was a potential death sentence. He had to surrender his command. He had to listen. Lara did not falter. She didn't possess the physical strength to carry him, so she carried his awareness instead. 2 steps, Kael. The ground drops here, she would say, her voice calm and authoritative over the roaring wind. Twisted steel on your right, lean left. She was no longer just the high sensitive. She was his radar, his scout, and his absolute lifeline. For Kael, the humiliation of his helplessness slowly began to fade, replaced by a profound, unfamiliar sense of awe. He had always viewed the sensitives as soft, insulated academics, but the woman guiding him through the apocalypse possessed a psychological iron that put his tactical armor to shame. 3 hours into their trek, the air pressure shifted. Lara suddenly stopped, her free hand pressing flat against Kael's chest plate, pushing him back against a massive slab of fallen concrete. "Hold," she breathed, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Kael couldn't see it, but he could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of a massive hydraulic walker approaching through the ash. It wasn't the frail gray sweeps. It was a heavy reptilian hunter-killer drone. "I hear it," Kael whispered, his jaw tight. He instinctively reached for his rifle, but his hands grasped empty air. He remembered Lara was holding it. He was a soldier with no weapon and no eyes. "Give me the rifle." "No," Lara whispered, stepping closer to him. Her back pressed against his chest as the red scanning lasers of the massive drone swept over the rubble just inches above their heads. "You can't see to aim, Kael. If you miss the primary core, we die. We wait." Kael's every instinct screamed at him to fight, to take back control, to dominate the threat. It took every ounce of his legendary discipline to lock his muscles and stand completely still in the dark. He let his hands fall to his sides. He surrendered the moment entirely to her judgment. They waited in the suffocating dark, listening to the massive machine tear through the rubble just feet away. Kael focused entirely on the physical reality of the woman pressed against him, the steady, calm rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her body against the cold steel of his armor. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he was no longer just protecting a civilian. They were a single, functioning unit. Finally, the heavy footsteps faded into the distance. Lara let out a long, shaky breath and stepped away. "It's gone," she said. Kael let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He reached out into the dark, finding the familiar curve of her shoulder, and placed his heavy hand upon it. It was no longer just a physical anchor. It was an acknowledgement. An absolute, unspoken transfer of trust. "Lead the way, Lara," he said softly. They found sanctuary miles later, deep within a naturally occurring cave system that had been insulated from the plasma strikes above. It was dark, silent, and finally free of the toxic ash. Kael slumped against the cold stone wall, the sheer adrenaline of the forced march finally evaporating. He stripped away the heavy, scorched remnants of his chest plate with clumsy, blind hands, dropping the metal to the floor with a loud clang. He was exhausted, broken, and completely in the dark. Lyra moved silently in the dark. She knelt in front of him, the soft rustle of her polymer robes the only sound in the cave. "The optic nerve is severely traumatized, Kael," she said softly, "but it is not dead. I can repair the physical pathways, but it will take hours of continuous resonance. You have to stay perfectly still." "I'm not going anywhere," Kael muttered. Lyra placed her delicate hands gently over his unseeing eyes. Instantly, a soft, bioluminescent blue light began to radiate from her palms. A deep, soothing warmth penetrated Kael's skull, melting away the sharp, jagged pain of the flash burn. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the small thermal charge Lyra had set. The darkness Kael had been trapped in slowly began to shift, the absolute black giving way to swirling, shadowy shapes. He could feel her mind working, a gentle, rhythmic vibration at the edge of his own consciousness. "Why do you wear it like a coffin, Kael?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Kael frowned in the dark. "Wear what?" "Your duty," Lyra said softly. "Your armor. When I looked into your mind on the observation deck, there was no fear. But there was no joy either. There was only the wall. You have built a fortress around yourself so thick that nothing can get in, not even light." Kael tensed, his jaw tightening. "The wall keeps people alive. I'm a perimeter guard, Lyra. 5 years ago, during the outer colony riots, the wall broke. I let my guard down, and people I was supposed to protect died." His voice hardened. "I decided it was easier to be a machine than a man. Machines don't grieve. They just hold the line." Lyra didn't pull away. The warmth of her hands deepened. "You are exhausted, Kael," she whispered. "You are exhausted because you are trying to be a wall of stone in a universe of energy. You cannot force yourself to love the world when you are spending every ounce of your strength trying to protect it." Kael swallowed hard. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "You have to give yourself permission to be loved," Lyra said, her voice carrying the absolute, ancient wisdom of her caste. "You do not have to fight for it. You do not have to earn it with a rifle. You just have to allow someone to see the man behind the machine. If you don't, Kael, you will survive the war, but you will die in the dark." The words hit him harder than the blast wave from the crescent ships. He sat in the dark, the warmth of her hands seeping into his mind, and for the first time in 5 years, the heavy, crushing weight of his self-imposed isolation began to crack. He slowly reached up, his large, calloused hands gently holding her delicate wrists. He didn't pull her hands away. He just held them there, accepting the healing, accepting the truth, and finally, quietly, giving himself permission to rest. Kael lurved to the smell of dust and the faint glow of the dying thermal charge. He blinked. The absolute darkness was gone. The world was blurry, washed out in grays and shadows, but it was there. He blinked again, and the jagged walls of the cave snapped into sharp, beautiful focus. His sight had returned. He turned his head. Lyra was slumped against the cave wall, deeply asleep. The hours of continuous resonance healing had drained her physical reserves completely. She looked incredibly fragile, her pale green skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Before Kael could move to wake her, the heavy rock at the entrance of the cave exploded inward with a deafening crack. The silence shattered. 3 heavy reptilian assault drones, massive, heavily armored machines built for subterranean clearing, burst into the cavern. Their red, scanning lasers cut violently through the darkness, instantly locking onto Lyra's sleeping form. Lyra jolted awake, screaming as the heavy plasma cannons began to charge. But she didn't have to run. Kael moved with a speed born of pure, unadulterated instinct. The blind man she had led through the ash was gone. The machine had returned, but this time, the machine had a soul. He lunged across the cave floor, his hand wrapping around the heavy grip of his particle rifle in one fluid, explosive motion. He stepped directly in front of Lyra, totally eclipsing her fragile form with his broad, unarmored shoulders. He didn't seek cover. He didn't hesitate. He raised the heavy rifle from the hip and fired. The cavern shook with the thunderous, concussive blasts. The lead drone was blown backward, its central core shattering in a shower of sparks and black fluid. The second drone fired, a beam of red plasma searing a deep gash into Kael's unarmored side, but he didn't even flinch. He walked forward, absorbing the pain, dominating the physical space, and fired twice more, reducing the machines to burning scrap metal. The echoes of the gunfire slowly faded, replaced by the hiss of melting slag. Kael lowered the smoking rifle. His side was bleeding, his body covered in ash, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He turned back to Lyra. She was looking up at him, her dark eyes wide. She had been the guide. She had been the healer. But in that moment, seeing him stand between her and death, she didn't feel the need to be strong anymore. She stepped forward and willingly, beautifully, rested her head against his broad, muscular chest. She buried her face into his shoulder, closing her eyes, letting his raw physical strength become her absolute sanctuary. Kyle wrapped his heavy, unarmored arms securely around her waist, holding her tight. The armor was gone, but the protector remained. They emerged from the cave system an hour later, climbing the winding bedrock until they reached a high, blasted ridge overlooking the northern expanse. The Aegis Vault was only a few miles away. But as Kyle and Lyra stepped out onto the jagged stone and looked up, they realized the true, horrifying scale of their reality. The war was not just for the city, it was for the heavens themselves. The sky was a chaotic, blinding tapestry of violently conflicting energy. Massive rectangular dreadnoughts, ships that looked as if they had been carved from pure glowing crystal, had arrived from the deep void. They were engaging the brutalist crescent-shaped ships that had burned the city. The crystalline ships fired beams of impossible icy blue lightning. It wasn't plasma and it wasn't kinetic. It was a defensive energy. Where the crescent ships fired red-orange heat rays to vaporize the surface, the crystalline ships fired their blue lightning to violently cool the burning atmosphere, desperately trying to push back the encroaching firestorm. It was a battle of absolute thermal extremes, and hovering high above the crossfire, completely untouched by the devastating heat rays and the icy lightning, was a silent, diamond-shaped eye. It glided through the upper atmosphere like dark oil, vibrating slightly with deep purples and blues. It fired no weapons. It offered no aid. It simply watched. It was a recorder, a silent witness, burning the death of a world into its eternal memory. But the final fatal blow of the war didn't come from the crescent ships. Lyra gasped, her hands flying to her temples. She collapsed to her knees, a psychic scream so loud and devastating ripping through the solar system that even Kyle could feel the phantom ringing in his own mind. He followed her gaze up past the warring fleets to the neighboring star, Maldek. The planet didn't just burn, it shattered. A blinding, terrifying flash of pure white light erupted in the deep void. Maldek was gone. In its place was a violently expanding cloud of planetary debris, glowing with the horrific heat of a murdered lord. And then the sky began to fall. The fragments of Maldek, massive chunks of superheated rock and molten core, were caught in Mars' gravitational pull. Millions of flaming lava rocks began to rain down on the Martian surface, streaking through the atmosphere like a storm of vengeful fire. The molten rocks crashed into the ground like heavy artillery shells, blowing massive, jagged craters deep into the earth. Kyle didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lyra by the harness of her robes, hauling her to her feet, and ran toward the massive steel gates of the Aegis Vault. They made it to the threshold of the deep planetary sanctuary, but the relentless impact, tremors from the meteor storm had warped the heavy hydraulic tracks. The massive doors were jammed halfway open. Outside, the toxic ash was thickening into a suffocating fog, and the flaming rocks were falling closer by the second. Inside was absolute safety, but only if the door was completely sealed. Kyle didn't say a word. He grabbed Lyra by the shoulders and shoved her violently into the dark interior of the bunker. Then he turned back to the outside. He grabbed the scorching metal edge of the blast door with his bare hands. The steel was superheated from the atmospheric friction, but Kyle ignored the sudden, sickening pain. He planted his heavy boots into the stone threshold, locked his spine, and pushed. Inside the dark bunker, Lyra screamed his name. Her telepathic mind was suddenly flooded with the raw, searing physical agony Kyle was experiencing. She felt the heat blistering his palms. She felt the micro tears in his muscles. It was an agony that would have broken a lesser man instantly. But Kyle took the pain. He absorbed it, pushing it deep down into the furnace of his own willpower, because he had finally accepted her love, and he was willing to break his own body to ensure she survived. With a final, agonizing, primal roar, the warped hydraulics shattered. The massive blast door slammed violently shut, sealing the locking pins and replacing the roar of the apocalypse with the heavy, echoing silence of the deep earth. The silence of the Aegis Vault was profound. Kyle collapsed against the cold steel wall of the airlock, his hands raw and blistered, his breathing ragged. Lyra caught him, wrapping her arms around his waist to keep him upright. Together they limped out of the airlock and into the massive humming expanse of the planetary command center. Commander Vane, a stern, gray-haired veteran of the orbital wars, turned from the central holographic console. He looked at the bruised, ash-covered soldier and then at the high sensitive clinging to him. "You survived the perimeter collapse," Vane said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Report, soldier. What is happening out there?" Kyle stood as straight as his battered body would allow. "The surface is gone, Commander. Maldek has been destroyed. We are under bombardment from planetary debris and Crescent-class warships. But I am not the report you need." Kyle looked down at Lyra, nodding once. "She is." Lyra stepped forward, pulling away from Kyle's protective grip. She moved with the ancient grace of her caste, placing the glowing crystalline data drive onto the center console. "This drive contains the deep space psychic telemetry of the invasion," Lyra said softly, though her voice carried through the massive vault. "But the data is only the past. I have seen the future." Commander Vane stepped back, intimidated by the sudden, overwhelming psychic pressure radiating from her. Lyra's dark eyes seemed to lose focus on the room, staring instead into the infinite depths of time. "We cannot stay here," Lyra commanded. "Mars is dead. The surface will never recover. But there is another world, a blue and green sphere, closer to the sun." Vane frowned. "Earth? It is a primitive rock. It is hot, humid, and completely overrun with massive wild reptilian beasts. It is uninhabitable for our kind." "Not forever," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "The beasts will be wiped out. In the future, our descendants will eventually call that blue planet home. But the cold minds, the ones who burned our sky today, they will follow us there. They will attempt to enslave our kind, wrapping the new world in a psychic quarantine, and for countless thousands of years they will succeed." She turned away from the commander, walking back to Kyle. She reached out, taking his blistered, scarred hands gently in her own. "But eventually, far in the future, the quarantine will break. We will remember who we are. We will be free again. But unless we leave this dead stone and make the journey to that new world, there is no hope for any of us." The story you just heard is fiction, but the war was real. The exploding planet of Maldek, the raining fire on the Martian surface, the clashing extraterrestrial armadas, and the psychic quarantine of Earth are hidden in ancient religious texts, suppressed histories, and global mythology. We know because we looked. Discover the actual blind remote viewing data that uncovered the true war in heaven, and learn the real history of humanity's ancient past. See the evidence. Visit FarsightPrime.com.